to discuss this question. And today we invited several experts in this area to share their research and thoughts with us so that we can, together with our collective wisdom, to move forward. So now, with our audience all here, I would like to introduce our first group of speakers. We have Mr. Alan Jensen, the coordinator of North America International Association for Peace and Economic Development. Also, Michael Graney, the Director of Research, Center for Economic and Social Justice. And they will be sharing and speaking on the topic of the principle of interdependence and economic democracy. Welcome. So Alan, now I give the screen to you.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's a joy to be here with all of you. And I agree with Dr. John, we're a family, and that's how we approach this. And that's how we want to proceed and build a culture, right? I'd like to share my screen if I could, just to get started here. Here we go. Just a few things. I thought it'd be easier for everybody if I could use some of the words taken from this book. Slideshow, there we go, from the beginning. Okay, so, you know, just building off what was said, I think that, you know, we see that there's all these divisions and conflicts. So what we're looking for, we feel that our leaders don't really have a coherent body of definitions, principles, and theories that really can guide us into the future that we're looking for, social justice, economic justice, and peace. So we're looking for this universal, unifying, and practical paradigm. And that's kind of what the models refer to. Because the truth is, you know, that our current system has critical flaws. And these flaws really are fueling problems we experience. And we're rapidly approaching a financial cliff, moral cliff. On top of that, you have the specter of AI, and that's a loss of millions of jobs. So it's not too hard to think that without a coherent view and understanding, it's not hard to see that imagine that our political leaders would take us down the wrong road. But I think that hopefully we can offer some hope here. This book just was published in 2021. Some of the essays came out a few years ago, and there were 6 essays under the area of interdependence that focus in the economic area. And myself and a team of our IED brothers in Europe primarily, we've been looking at this just recently, and I thought it'd be helpful, given that this is a UPF seminar, to highlight just a couple of key concepts. So there's a lot to study. They say they're hoping that this principle of interdependence, which arises out of a deeper philosophical basis, which we call unification thought, but it can't provide a theoretical basis for the presenting of a fresh discourse on modern economic theory and economic systems. So let's begin here. So there's really 2 core concepts that they highlight. First is ownership. I think we all understand we want to live in an ownership kind of culture. Ownership gives credibility and depth to your participation. So the principle of interdependence focuses on ownership. And it says here that, you know, there's all throughout history, there's been this dynamic between the public and the private ownership. It hasn't always been sorted out yet, right? But that's the dynamic, and we can't really avoid dealing with that. We want to note that the ideological root of the principle of interdependence lies in this liberalism, which is an ideological system that asserts that human freedom, life, and property are natural and God-given rights bestowed on humankind, and that an individual's right to private property is inviolable. And yet there's public ownership. To build a good society, we have to take into account both public needs and private needs and find that harmonious balance. So the principle proposes to address this dilemma of public and private with a new concept of ownership based on God's love, where all things ultimately recognized as belonging to God. how would that change? And then bring in a whole new element of thought, right? My property in partnership with God, in partnership with a greater humanity spirit. So joint ownership is contrasted to the humanistic ideals of public ownership that are found in modern utopianism and socialism, and also in, monopolistic private ownership and capitalism. So we want to be sure that we're speaking in a larger spiritual framework here. And that's what it says here. We'll read, when the principle of interdependence speaks of joint ownership, it advocates for the joint ownership with God based on true love. Love makes the world go round, right? In this regard, it's wary of contemplating public ownership from a human-centered perspective with the denial of God, the denial of a spiritual essence. So that's the first part. Then so externally, it's implied in two ways here. Externally, quickly, it would encourage growth of economic structures such as cooperatives, mutual companies, employee stock ownership companies, various forms of public and private partnerships, and other community-based economic entities. Why? We want to foster that give and take, that joint feeling. We're in this together, that sense of belonging. We also encourage excellence in management practices that strive in a corporation, for example, to build a family culture of goodwill and let's say it, love, right? In employee and customer relationships, that heart that goes in. So again, on the other end, joint ownership calls for this transformative change in the mental paradigm of greed and excessive private ownership to one based on heart, where consciousness of self and others leads then to economic activity with the common good always in mind. So the principle of interdependence theory has created a term for this type of self-controlled ownership. They go into it quite a bit in the writings, reasonable ownership, where a psychological element of ownership is factored in to awaken the individual's conscience. Imagine people with running by conscience. That would rein in selfish desires and work against, that can work against a higher purpose, selfish desires. The second core concept is distribution. And let's read. The issues of poverty and inequality are social and economic structural problems arising from failed distribution, and at the same time, an economic structural phenomenon with multiple causes and characteristics related to human capital. Again, we're looking at this internally and externally, different ways of approaching the problem of failed distribution. So internally, a wider distribution of wealth would naturally flow when there is an ethic of reasonable ownership taking hold in the hearts and minds and actions of the economic agents of the system, individuals, households, and businesses. And then forms of joint ownership, not just commanded from above, but flowing from the heart, would then evolve, that would form a counterbalance to the tendency for greed to grow unchecked, which we know corrupts the economic system when it's based primarily on motives of excess private profit or of government control, bureaucratic control. So externally, structurally, the principle of interdependence, because we want to solve the problem, right? If there's internal, we know that really needs to take place, but externally, we propose policies that should be based on distribution-friendly growth, where inequality can be lessened through the process of economic growth itself. In contrast to growth-friendly policies, which are those that give the first consideration to growth, where the fruits of that economic production disproportionately reach large companies and high-income earners, those that already have capital. Under the latter scenario, if you think about this really struck me. Any attempt at a wider distribution of wealth is necessarily left to the political sector through various non-economic redistribution schemes. And this leads to a fight among interest groups, waste, and inefficiency. So I don't think we can see a future where the economic systems generates the wealth and the political system distributes the wealth. I don't think that's a sustainable world and a world of heart. So given this background, I found it quite interesting that one of the papers in this was a study of economic democratization based on unification thought that was taking place in Korea. And they're even said on both sides of the political aisle, there was discussion about economic democracy. So before I turn this over to Mr. Graney, who will dive more deeply into this, I want to share two historical examples that I find very compelling. The first is from the founder of the Universal Peace Federation, the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. He had a keen understanding that in the progress of history, providential history as he would term it, democracies were born to dismantle what he termed satanic monopolies of power, thought, and ownership. He had this to say about economic democracy, writing in the 1950s. Democracies of two types arose with the purpose of dismantling absolute monarchy, transferring sovereignty to the people, and demolishing economic systems which concentrate a society's wealth in the hands of a privileged few. And you're speaking about democracies on the materialistic side, communism, socialism, and on the more religious-based side of liberal democracy. So, but each of these movements sought to establish a system which would distribute wealth more equally among people. Because human beings are created to live in an ideal society, they will inevitably pursue a socialistic ideal. That's our heart, where we want to live in a harmonious way. But we strive for freedom. And this then is our goal, to seek a society truly based on a truly democratic economic system. So I'm inspired by that. Second, and I've been studying and looking for this for years, and second one that I came across that I want to highlight is from the book Capitalist Manifesto, 1958, authored by a very well-known American philosopher, Mortimer Adler, and Louis Kelso. I'd like to share some of Adler's words and let him tell the story. So after many years, he says, I slowly came to realize that political democracy cannot flourish under all economic conditions. Democracy requires an economic system which supports the political ideals of liberty and equality for all. Men cannot exercise freedom in the political sphere when they are deprived of it in the economic sphere. But what type, he wondered. Could capitalism evolve to establish the kind of economic democracy which political democracy required as its counterpart? He had his doubts. For many years, I was prone to some of the errors and fallacies which blind socialists to the truth about capitalism and democracy. And it was precisely these errors in my own thinking which made me doubt that capitalism as such, i.e. not creeping socialism disguised as capitalism, could create the economic democracy which would provide the very soil and atmosphere in which political democracy can prosper. These errors remain with me, he says, until I became acquainted with the thought of Louis Kelso. According to Mr. Kelso's theory, capitalism, perfected in the line of its own principles without any admixture of socialism, can indeed create the economically free and classless society which will support political democracy and which, above all, will help us preserve the institutions of a free society, not one that is burdened by state governments and over bureaucracies, but a free society. So the economic theory of Louis Kelso is coming from a new paradigm called binary economics. It is now also known as the just third way and is being carried on and developed today by Mr. Kelso's protege, Norm Kurland, and his daughter, Dawn, and Michael Graney from the Center for Economic Social Justice, who I'll turn it over to in 1 minute. But I just want to say one last thing, and that is that Norm Kurland has spoken at some of UPF's earlier programs or in the early 2000s. So it's a great partnership, and I'm inspired by the idea of economic democracy as a vision that we can follow. And Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you. I've probably taken too much time already.
When Michael is ready, we will just switch back to here. I'm sure he will share more examples about what they are practicing on the current model. So now I would like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Catherine Trebeck. So Catherine is an advocate for economic change with roles including writing residence at the University of Edinburgh and a strategic advisor to the Next Economy and for the Center for Policy Development. She co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, Scotland, and instigated the Wellbeing Economy Government Partnership. And she will share with us the topic of rethinking our economic models so they serve humanity rather than the other way around. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Jennifer. And hi, everyone. Really lovely to be here. This is such a fascinating, rich discussion already, diving very deep into some concepts that are very, very dear to my heart. So, John, your phrase about being amongst friends, I really am feeling that even within the 40 minutes or so that we've been going. So thank you for that space you've created. And I just can't say how important conversations are like this for allowing us to ask harder questions of our economic system. So full congratulations to all the organisers who made this afternoon happen. And I had planned to not speak for too long because I think the dialogue and amongst friends and colleagues and kicking around ideas is really important, but also even more so now that some of the critique of the current economic system that I was going to share with you has been laid out so powerfully already by Alan and by Jennifer. So thank you for that. And it means I can just skip forward a little bit. I don't have slides, partly because I do too many slides in my my weekly life, and so Saturday afternoon to me didn't feel like a time for slides. But I want to, before I do talk more positively about the sort of the vision that I hope collectively society and change agents particularly can start to build, I want to just sort of underscore a couple of the elements of today's economic system. I mean, Jennifer so powerfully highlighted this idea that sort of more is so often assumed to be good, whether that's more GDP growth at the level of the macroeconomy, but also, of course, whether that's just more and more for individuals. There's this assumption that having more, regardless of what that is a way to boost individual well-being. And so just, accumulation of stuff, no matter the quality or the use or the purpose of that stuff, that's something that's deeply seated in how people and particularly policymakers and politicians think about the economy. And we see that translating profoundly at the macro level in terms of, you only have to turn on your evening news or your morning radio station to hear politicians saying that their main job is to get the economy growing faster. And so often you hear ideas such as investing in education or gender equality, for example, almost framed as an input to that economic growth, which to me just seems so perversely the wrong way around. Why aren't we asking what can economic growth do for things like education and gender equality? And so these are sort of concepts that are so far at the back of our minds, we often don't have the time or the space or the permission to even question them. The other point I want to add really is the extent to which this assumption of trickle down is embedded in that thinking as well. There's so often this idea that if we grow the economy, the assumption is that will be an automatic read across to things like poverty reduction and to good jobs. And yet we have seen in decades past that we can't automatically assume that that's going to happen. I've just come back from almost 2 decades living in Scotland and particularly in Glasgow. And this is, part of the 6th richest country in the world in GDP terms. Just up the road from where I lived in Glasgow, there were people whose, the average life expectancy was 54. That's below the level of Haiti. And so that's just one example, and I suspect you may be able to think of your own, where we've seen that having wealth in a GDP sense, and then so often averaged out by per capita, beware the tyranny of averages, doesn't automatically generate more for those who really do need more. The other point, and Jennifer, you made this really nicely, around the environment being seen as an input to production and consumption systems, and then also a sink for the waste generated by that. And that's a hugely, it's a really painful example of, again, something that speaks to our mindset of imagining human beings as on top of the environment, sitting above it, commanding it, bossing it around, using it for human purposes, rather than understanding the intrinsic value of the environment, let alone seeing us as ourselves as a part of the environment and the natural world. And also, Jennifer, you hinted at this really nicely as well, around the fact that the market's decisions are always right. I was speaking at a conference a few months ago where they had the chief economist of one of the major banks in Australia. I won't name names because you might know him. And he said, well, of course, markets just operate by the interaction of supply and demand. And I could not believe that this is 2022, a very well-educated economist was still suggesting that it is that simple. To ignore questions of power, information asymmetries, different preferences and so on, plus the political elements of that shape markets, just was staggering to me that someone in that position was still uttering those sorts of axioms that you'd read about in your first year economics, but wouldn't necessarily translate to how things really, really work. And I want to just sort of really note how these dynamics, this way this economic system is playing out, what that's resulted in. I mean, I don't think I need to tell you all, but I think it's worth really reminding us when we're talking about the way the economy operates, is that it's had a huge impact on the planet. We see warnings coming from scientists almost day after day, and scientists often do not get shouty. They are getting shouty now. The IPCC, for example, really not pulling their punches in warning about this. This is Antonio Guterres's words, but based on last year's IPCC report of a code red for humanity in terms of climate change, but of course also biodiversity loss and land use change are other elements of environmental breakdown. And so we have to keep that at the forefront of our minds when we're talking about the economic system, what it is doing to our natural planetary home. And also, and again, Alan talked about this so beautifully and powerfully around the extent of inequalities. I spent almost 10 years working with Oxfam, who generated some of those statistics around the extent to which wealth is captured by the very top. And when people say the economic system is broken, I profoundly disagree with that. Because I think what's happening is we're seeing the economic system do exactly what it is designed to do, because you have a confluence of wealth and power, which means that those who are very wealthy in a financial sense are able to shape the rules of the game to generate more returns. This is what the great systems thinker Donella Meadows describes as success to the successful, that you're able to sort of repurpose and shape the rules of the game to benefit those who have already got more. There's two other points I want to make around sort of critiquing the current system. One is around the role of economic growth. And we have an economic system that is largely dependent on economic growth, but also designed for more economic growth. And I want to be really honest that in parts of the world, even parts of Australia, even parts of the city where I'm living, there will be individuals and communities that don't have enough to meet their basic material needs. In those places, they do need more. With the big caveat, it needs to be well used and go to those who need it most. So it needs to be used to invest in collective institutions, health systems, education systems, and it needs to be proactively pro-poor. So go to those who need that growth the most. And so that shows us that when growth is used well, and those big caveats are really important. We can't just assume that any old growth will cut the mustard. But when growth is used well, it can yield quite decent returns in terms of social progress, however you want to look at social progress, whether that's increasing in education, reduction in infant mortality, increasing life expectancy, literacy rates, even individual subjective well-being. When you don't have enough, having more when it's of the right quality and used well does matter. But what happens is those returns start to tail off. And so this is this idea of diminishing marginal returns. And I was trying to explain this to someone who's not particularly an economist the other day. And I said, well, I love ice cream, right? So it's a bit like going to an ice cream and have, on a hot day like this, having your first ice cream. And my gosh, on a day when it's sort of mid-30s, that first ice cream is fantastic. You're going to get a lot of return from that first ice cream. Do you know what? Maybe even second ice cream. Someone like me who's obsessed with ice cream, maybe even third ice cream. But by the time you're looking at your sort of 7th, 8th, 15th ice cream, you've well and truly entered the stage of diminishing marginal returns. The benefits from having more and more have started to tail off. And you can see that when you compare countries by their GDP per capita compared to various dimensions of social progress, that the returns to benefits from growth in GDP per capita terms do start to tail off. So to give you an example, you have the same level of social progress measured by an index called the Social Progress Index, which you can find all their data online, where you have South Korea and Costa Rica having the same level of social progress, but a difference in GDP per capita of about 40,000 US. And yet what's happened is GDP per capita in South Korea hasn't yielded any more social returns. And the risk is that a great sort of ecological economist like Herman Daly, who passed away just a few months ago, would say, do you know what? That idea of diminishing marginal returns, that's actually quite a benign concept, because what we really see is that some of these countries are entering a stage of actually uneconomic growth, where what they're having to do is spend a lot of that wealth healing, repairing, responding to, and fixing the damage that comes from pushing down more and more on the pedal or the accelerator of trying to get more economic growth once we've passed the stage of diminishing marginal returns. This is where if I was doing slides, I'd be showing you some graphs. But there's an idea that I want to sort of lodge in your minds, and I hope if you can take this away and start using this idea when you're reading the newspapers and listening to political pronouncements in the coming days and weeks. And it's an idea that comes from management literature. It's a chap called John Steadden, and it's an idea that he terms failure demand. And he says to the businesses that he worked with, do you know what? Just because you're getting more demand for things like your call center, that's not necessarily a sign of success, because if they are complaints ringing in and demanding more of you because your services weren't working in the first place because they were failing, just beware of that. There's failure demand. And about 10 years ago in Scotland, where I've just moved back from, there was a huge commission into the future of public services. It's called the Christie Commission. You can look it up online. And the Christie Commission took that idea of failure demand from management literature and said, do you know what? We recognize that in social policy terms. We see that so often what local government and other levels of government, I dare to say even a lot of charities are working on, is driven by the collective failure of our economic systems to deliver the sort of lives for people that they need. So, for example, you see education systems having to invest in remedial education because of the impact on poverty, on educational attainment. A lot of the criminal justice system, one could argue, is driven by poverty and inequality. Those of you who are in Australia will know there's been huge floods over the last few months, last year, and even longer than that, massive bushfires. So imagine the spending in responding to those huge incidents driven by climate breakdown and environmental breakdown over time for emergency services workers, insurance payouts, the rebuilding of all the houses and property that have been lost, not to mention anti-anxiety treatments for people who have been traumatized by going through those experiences. I live just up the road from a hospital here, and I so often hear the helicopter landing, the emergency helicopter landing on the roof of that hospital. If that's because of a car accident or because someone has overdosed, because they're self-medicating, because of their stressed life, because they're not feeling in control of their life, one could argue all of that is driven by our economic system that's not helping people feel safe and healthy and in control and fulfilled in the first place. So keep that idea of this sort of avoidable cost of so much of what our governments spend on. And I went through last Australian budget, or last year's Australian budget, looking at all the budget items that the Treasurer here, Jim Chalmers, was announcing. And so much of that, I think we could clock up as an example of avoidable cost, an example of failure demand. One is huge amounts of money going into the health system to respond to the health impacts of the climate crisis. A friend of mine in Melbourne, she works for the council there, has just been appointed a heat officer to help take care of vulnerable individuals in times of extreme heat. In the UK, huge numbers of food banks, which that's happened for many years now, they've now started opening warm banks, where during the winter, where people cannot afford to heat their homes because they're energy prices are so high, but also their homes are very energy inefficient and their incomes are so low, they're having to go to places like the local library, museums, and so on. A profound sign of failure. And I'd love it if you, over the next few days or even this afternoon, are thinking of examples that you might see in the news or in social policy as examples of that. Just shows how much is being spent responding to the current economic system. So what we've got is a system that generates wealth captured by those at the top. It's also those same people who are putting most pressure on the planet and using most of the planet's resources. There's a huge, the story of environmental breakdown is also a story of social justice in terms of who it is who's putting most pressure on the planet, but also who it is who is most damaged by that are so often the people who have least to benefit from the current economic system, who are not well served. And so social justice and environmental breakdown are two sides of the same coin. And that metaphor of the coin, I think, is all too apt because it is our economic system that links the two, how we produce and consume, design of businesses. So it's so great to hear Alan talk about economic democracy. That's a huge piece of the solution that we need to wrap our heads around and get our shoulders behind and support, but very much how we distribute our economic resources, how we even conceptualize the economy. And I want to I'm not going to take too much longer, but I want to wrap up by this by really just thinking how we think about the economy really matters. And so often the economy is seen as something that's separate, but also something that we need to serve. And Jennifer, you mentioned this in your opening remarks. I think it is time to really take heed of what ecological economists have been saying for decades, what feminist economists have been saying for decades, and to be really honest, what First Nations communities around the world have been living for millennia, to understand the economy as a subset of society and the two as a subset of nature, of our natural world. And that's really quite easy for me to say. But what it means is we need to start thinking about how can the economy be in service of society and the environmental outcomes we need and protecting the planet and sustaining a healthy planet rather than the other way around. And if our politicians were to take that seriously, we would see very, very different economic policy making. So I want to finish by just giving you a sense of what that might start to look like in practice. And I guess, as you can imagine, there's a whole plethora of changes necessary to build an economic system that's more in service of people and planet. The term wellbeing economy is one that's really taking off. It's got official endorsement by governments such as Wales and Scotland and the European Union. Hopefully Australia soon, this idea of an economy that's in service of people and planet rather than the other way around. But to get there, a whole lot of changes are needed, from the very, very local right up to the supranational, to what sort of business models we have, to how we tax and incentivize different activities, how we do our transport, our energy systems, and our very measures of progress. So imagine it like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Think about that, all these different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. We've already heard something like UBI. That would be a key piece of that jigsaw puzzle. Fortunately, there are people working on those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle too. So people are starting to build this in the here and now. How I grapple with that plethora of changes is that, remembering, if you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, what's the first thing you do? You start with the four corners. And so imagine the four corners of this jigsaw puzzle as what I describe as the 4 Ps of the wellbeing economy. So I'm going to go through them ever so briefly, and happy to come back to the maybe in a bit more detail in discussion or offline in the coming weeks. But the first P of our jigsaw puzzle is purpose. How do we understand the very purpose of the economy? Is it faster GDP growth? Or are we going to be fair weather friends of economic growth rather than its ever faithful followers? This means thinking about the direction and the composition of growth rather than just its rate, what's happening to quarterly increases in GDP per capita. It's also about then thinking about the goal of government being much more multidimensional. Multidimensional measures of wellbeing would come into this. In fact, over half of the OECD governments have multidimensional wellbeing frameworks, and Australia is just starting to go down that path of thinking about what one might look like for Australia. but also at the more micro level. It's also the same with business. Are enterprises just about short-term profit making, the sort of short-term equivalent of GDP for a business, or are they using commercial viability as a means rather than an end in itself? So a means to be the sort of business that Alan talked about, a business that centers love and conscience at its very center. So that's our first corner, and you can imagine all sorts of activities clustered there. The next one is prevention. And this is really the antidote to avoidable costs and failure demand, saying it's not good enough just to focus all our energies as society, as politicians, as policymakers on putting a sticking plaster on the damage of the current economic system. Yes, that's important today and tomorrow, because if we're really honest, that's a humanitarian response to an inhumane, unsustainable economic system. We have to help people and planet survive and cope. So I'm not saying stop that straight away, but I'm saying we can do better than that if we dare to imagine a better economic system. So we can take our time to look upstream and not just respond symptom by symptom, crisis by crisis, playing whack-a-mole. What we can do is say, what are the root causes of why there are more people sleeping rough? What are the root causes of why there's so many people in Australia in housing stress? What are the root causes of why young people are scared for their futures? What are the root causes of why communities around the world are being turfed off their land because of environmental damage? Why are so many people lonely in society and reaching for coping mechanisms at the pillbox or at the ballot box? So what are the root causes there? How can we do better? Whether that's decent jobs that deliver dignity and purpose and autonomy, or whether it's something like having a more circular economy, because the more circular our economy, the fewer beach cleanups we will need, and so on and so on. The next corner is one of my favorites, and it's around pre-distribution. And this picks up a lot of what Alan was describing earlier, saying at the moment, governments have a very heavy lift in trying to slightly reduce the gap between rich and poor that's generated by the market letting rip. In Australia, the government reduces economic inequality by about 30%, and we're still a pretty unequal country. That's a huge lift for government, and Alan talked about all the sort of political machinations, and we know it also the extent of tax evasion and avoidance that undermine that program. It also relies on a growing economy, because you need to grow the economy to have the wealth to redistribute. So couldn't we share things better first time round? Could we get the economy to do more of the heavy lifting in delivering the sort of outcomes that we really want? So things like worker cooperatives, economic democracy, true cost accounting will be the sort of thing you'd see in that corner of the jigsaw puzzle. And then the final one is people powered. How do we make sure that people and communities are at the forefront of these conversations, whether this is through participatory budgeting, through, again, economic democracy, through citizens' assembly, people really being in control of economic outcomes rather than just being hit and washed and battered by the waves and decisions taken somewhere else. So I'm going to finish there. I had a few examples to give you in terms of what this might look like in practice, but given I want to make sure there's some time for discussion, I'm going to park that, and perhaps we're happy to pick up that if you want to email me or in a later discussion. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Catherine. Questions in mind, but we have one question. You want to ask the same question.
Jennifer, we can hardly hear you. You may have to come closer to your microphone.
Okay, can you hear me now?
It's okay.
Oh, so today is strange. Okay.
We
I
can't
can read
hear
it,
you.
Jennifer. Should I just dive into it? I can read it. One question from Steve. Do I think that the WEF, the World Economic Forum, I'm guessing you mean there, Steve? Tell me if it's a different WEF, has the answers to these points you're addressing. To be really honest, and because it's Saturday afternoon, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. I think the World Economic Forum has no shortage of talking about these answers. I think, I follow the World Economic Forum's deliberations a lot. I get a lot of their regular updates. They are diving into these questions. They're talking about beyond GDP questions. They're talking about perhaps the conversation around degrowth. They're talking about universal basic income. They're talking about economic democracy. They're talking about sort of wealth taxes, all sorts of things that you'd expect to see on that jigsaw puzzle I talked about. Do I think the answers will come from a bunch of incredibly wealthy, rich people flying in on their private jets to a ski resort, who they can't even understand the absurdity of what that, the symbolism of that, where, they're not held to account by the people they impact? Absolutely not. I think that we're good on them for engaging in these questions and not shying away and not trying to paper over the problems of business as usual. Fair dues to them for that. Do I think the solutions will be found in the corridors of Davos meetings? No. Should I give you a couple of examples if we've got a minute, if there's no other questions, Jennifer? Yeah, just to sort of, I really find it inspiring to be reminded of that there are folks all over the world who are rolling up their sleeves and delivering this. And whether it's people in government, like in Wales, where they've got a Future Generations Commissioner who's coming to Australia next month. So keep an eye out. Her name's Sophie Howe. She's brought to you by one of the organisations I work for, the Centre for Policy Development. So see if you can catch some of her lectures. But Wales has this idea that they've got all their public agencies has to work on delivering the well-being of current and future generations. And Sophie's previous job, she's now retired, there's a new commissioner for future generations, is to hold governments and public agencies accountable for that. Whether it's things like in Italy, where they're supporting worker co-ops and have got clauses in their constitution to think about how can they have more worker co-ops in the economy, whether it's where I've just come back from, Scotland, where they measure their national success by something called the National Performance Framework that puts love and children growing up in kindness, diverse cultures at the very heart of economic policy making. And then whether it's amazing businesses, incredible enterprises like this one, I'm going to hold it up. I don't know if you can see that there. This is a cosmetics company called Upcircle, and they take old coffee beans and make them into face serums. This, believe it or not, is the part of the energy, so the engine of a toaster. And that's been taken apart by an amazing organisation called Remade, who say, don't just throw out your toaster if it breaks, or throw away your jeans if they've got holes in them. Bring them to us and we will repair them so you can keep those materials that are part of the toaster or part of your jeans in circulation longer. This is one of my favourite examples. This is a company called Green City Whole Foods. It's a worker cooperative based in Glasgow. It's been around since the 70s. They've got around 50 members, and their job is not to make profits for remote shareholders, but it's to generate benefits for their members. And they take decisions about shortening supply chains, so to reduce environmental impact. How can they be more organic? They absolutely pay living wages. And then one more example here, just lest you think these are all tiny, sweet examples. This is a major Dutch bank called Triodos Bank that is a registered B Corp, and it sees itself, its main job, as funneling financial resources into the sort of economic activities that are sustainable and more humane, more aligned with the sort of economy we need in the future. Plenty more examples of that, loads of examples on the Wellbeing Economy Alliance website as well. Jennifer, I'll shut up, that's more than enough for me.
Yeah, I have a question, but I need to bring out. So very good governance for the people and bad governance for the people, and too much money spent on defense budget and conflicts and wars. Comment, please. That's from Kasim.
Sorry, I'm just reading this now.
Yeah,
I mean, I think I guess I'd love to hear more from the Kasim, do you want to comment on that? I mean, I think you're right that the more we spend on defence, it's hard not to see as an example of an avoidable cost and an example of failure demand. Spending more because we're essentially scared of each other. Whether it's putting up security systems in our own homes, or dare I say it, spending on massive nuclear submarines. But yeah, I'd love you to reflect on that instead of me.
Yeah. So I have a question, Catherine.
Okay, can I say something?
Yes.
In response to Catherine? Yes, I have been concerned about all this because Australia was a very good country when I come from Malaysia to study in 1970s, and the distribution of wealth at that time are more equal, and but now I think we see more people in the poor and neglected and things like that. So from Australia's point of view, I think if we can stop going to wars and spend all those money on the people, it would be a lot better. Now, on a bigger scale in the world, I think the same problem exists. Now, we have the knowledge actually to mutual prosperity. Just now I mentioned Switzerland and I mentioned Sweden, these two countries which I visited, and they manage this economy much better. So there's a lot less poverty of any significant in those two countries, for example. And so yeah, that is my key point. And another point I want to bring up is all these 50 years since 1945, the Second World War, we have spent trillions and trillions of dollars on wars and on defense weapon and budget and all that. And one United Nations study showed that if all this money can be distributed and spent well on the people, we could house everybody comfortably, happily, democratically, and with freedom and with prosperity and happiness and with love. Comment, please, from other experts.
I agree. And I think so, a ton of money spent on defense and all the industries behind it, but I think we shouldn't shy away from the power that those at the top of those industries have over politicians. But also the IMF has done a similar sort of study looking at the implicit subsidies that go to the fossil fuel industries, and it's something like $1 trillion a day. You'll be able to get this if you put into a search engine IMF study subsidies to fossil fuels. You'll find there's a few updates to this research, and essentially they looked at the subsidies and they define subsidies as essentially a cost imposed on a third party. So whether it's the obvious government subsidies, so here's a check to an oil company, for example, or building infrastructure to enable a mine to go ahead, or whether it's a local government having to spend more on its local hospitals because of increased asthma, with more particulates in the air that are causing people breathing problems, or whether it's cleaning up after oil spills or polluted rivers. They tallied all of that up and said it's an enormous amount of money that goes to those particular industries through these various aspects of subsidies. So I think you're absolutely right. These are the sort of questions we need to be able to ask much more powerfully and much more frequently to unpack this sort of idea that the economy we've got is efficient and successful. We need to start holding these examples up as like a mirror to the outcomes of the current economic system. So we don't start, I say so often, even after COVID, you saw politicians reach for 20th century recipes when we're no longer in a 20th century world. We need to start imagining doing better. And that's where this idea of the wellbeing economy and related concepts come in, saying, let's dare to imagine an economy that's in service of what people and planet need.
So I know we have to go on 4:30, so I think we will take 2 more questions. Here, Steve asked questions about what about the world population and current available resources? Do you have data to support?
So on resources and population. So one, there's more than enough food produced for even a population of 11 billion, which is where demographers are expecting world population to sort of peak and then start to decline in the coming decades and century. Currently, engineers estimate that between 30 and 50% of food and calories that are produced is wasted, and it's a big divide in lower income countries. It's between farm and market, and in countries like Australia, it's off consumers' plates because we buy too much and then we throw it away, and it's wasted, or we're obsessed about best before dates and so on. So much food is wasted, and to me, that's an example that there's enough to go around. So it is with other sort of resources in the world, whether that's steel, for example, there's enough to go around. We just don't share and cherish that very, very well. And then financially, as I was saying earlier, look how much we waste responding to the collateral damage of the current system, building more defense mechanisms because we're scared of each other, subsidizing oil companies and fossil fuel companies that are not aligned with the sort of economy we need. The question of population, so there's a formula that ecological economists and others use to look at the impact on the planet. It's called the IPAT equation. So it's impact equals population times affluence times technology, essentially energy, efficiency by which we use resources. To me, the big element in that is affluence, because we know there's huge inequalities in terms of who it is who's putting most pressure on the planet. And I don't think the environment's going to be saved by folks in lower income countries who are very, very light footprints having one or two fewer children, when we know that because of their inadequate government systems, that's the best insurance they will get. I think our planet will be saved by people with very high income consumerist lifestyles, flying less, having smaller homes, also, to be honest, maybe having fewer children, so bringing less high consumption people into the world, maybe shifting their diet, changing how they travel. That's, to me, where the onus of discussion has to be. The other point around population is I think it also, even from, just do a thought experiment for me for a moment. Imagine if we brought, if the population came down to say 2 million and everyone could live an American lifestyle, that still wouldn't change an economic system that treats individuals and workers as just-in-time inventory, that generates huge levels of inequalities and injustice. It would still be a very extractive economic system. So what I don't want is the focus on the P in that equation to distract us from the way the economic system and production and consumption systems operate. So it's there, it's important. I'm not saying population doesn't matter, but it's sort of like population of who and what are their consumption footprints and so on. And I think we need to, almost look at ourselves in the mirror first and our own environmental footprint rather than look at others.
Okay, so thank you, Catherine. There's one question I would like to ask from Salva. He said, thank you, Catherine, for the example you have just given, which exactly go to the question, what kind of vision of human flourishing is behind the 4 Ps you mentioned in your speech?
Yeah, so great question. And I'm not sure I quite understand exactly, so correct me if I've misinterpreted here, but I'm a huge sort of, I don't know, he's an intellectual hero of mine, scholars like Manfred Max Neef, and this idea of sort of fundamental human needs, and this idea that across the world, human beings have very, very common fundamental needs for a sense of belonging, yes, for subsistence, but for dignity, for relationships, for being taken care of, for security, for time in nature. And yes, they satisfy those needs in very, very different ways. That's where we get the beautiful diversity of this amazing world. But at their deepest, there's a real sense of fundamental human needs. And I think that's also mirrored in some of the works on shared human values that people like Shalom Schwartz have looked at, the sense that all of us hold similar sorts of values. Some of us emphasize some over the other, and some of them can be a bit like a seesaw. But most people actually put more emphasis on intrinsic values than extrinsic. The problem is we think other people focus more on extrinsic values. So we're almost sort of reacting and designing policies because we think the worst of each other, when actually and you can look at an organization like Common Cause for some research on this. It shows that actually, deep down, and I see this in participatory democracy exercises like citizens' assemblies, or also just sitting down and asking people what matters most to them when they're given a chance to catch their breath, have a cup of tea or a beer and reflect on what most matters to them. You'll find around the world, and I've done some of this research in post-industrial parts of Glasgow, in India, and a colleague of mine did a very similar exercise in Namibia. When people have these conversations, you know what they say most matters? Having enough money, so having sufficiency of income to participate, security of income matters more than the magnitude. So you think about that, compared to the gig economy and the casualized economy we're getting. Time with family and friends, knowing that you and those you care about are safe, your health, but also a sense of dignity and purpose. And those things are universal around the world. This is what makes us innately human. But it's sort of that sort of work around, common values, but also Manfred Max Neef's work that I find really compelling. Jennifer, there's a question around economic democracy. Because of time, because I know there's other speakers, I just refer to one of the elements of economic democracy I find really compelling, that's really exciting, is the community wealth building agenda. It's really building ahead of steam in the US and the UK. And it's essentially about saying, can we generate economies from the grassroots community up, local economic multipliers, asking question about local ownership, local employment, where procurement happens, and so on. Loads on the organisation called the Democracy Collaborative. Have a look at their stuff for that. That's a part of economic democracy. By no means the sum total, but it's a key part of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine. I just want to jump in, Jennifer, to mention to you that we have Hannah Kolar and Catherine Maldonado with us. So they will conclude our last two speakers, and I'm hoping they'll have enough time to present. And I will say this, I feel like this would be really the first of a series of forums on mutual prosperity. And we did lose Michael Allen, but I think for the sake of time, we'll conclude with our two, if that's okay, Jennifer, with our two ladies who will be speaking to us now, and with our concluding remarks as well. So I'll hand it back to you, and thank you, Catherine.
So just like Michael still cannot come in. Michael? Okay. So in this case, thank you, Catherine. And Dad is coming, so have a to pick him up. And thank you very much for sharing your great thoughts for us. I guess we have more to talk. I have personal question to ask. I will email you. And I know you have to go. And thank you very much. Now I think we will come to our last presentation. And I want to introduce, and John said it's based on, let me just have a look on our agenda. So we have Catherine and Hannah give us the speech, but we have Dr. Anis, actually, head of Mission International Institute for Middle East and Balkan Studies, addressing the topic of common future of our human capital, education as social capital. But due to some personal reasons, he sent his representative, Hannah and Catherine, to share with us his thoughts and ideas on this topic. So let's welcome Hannah and Catherine for the speech. So Hannah, as we discussed, I will turn to you and you can share your screen.
Yep, I'm happy to share my screen. Let me just set it up because I'm awful at Zoom and I have to admit that. So I'm going to play around with it and hopefully I can get it to share. Give me just a moment. Are you guys able to see my screen?
Yeah, very clear, very good.
Beautiful, okay. I'm not technologically advanced, I have to say. I'm just going to try and get it to play my presentation.
Yeah, it's just same as you use on your own computer. Yeah, because you shared the screen to us. Good. Now it's presentation.
Yes, of course. I believe Catherine wanted to talk first. I'm going to give the floor to her and then I will speak after if she'd like.
Okay. Catherine? So Catherine, you there? I think you. Yeah, you emailed me, so Catherine.
I think she was there just a moment ago, but
Yes,
somehow
mic
I
isn't
can't see
working.
her in the participant list anymore. So
I
Hannah,
can see her
you can see her?
list. Yeah, it's there's two Catherines, so you know.
Yeah.
Hey,
But
we
I
know,
think her mic
we
isn't
know.
working.
I think the other Catherine is adjusting her speaker because I saw her speaker is on. It's just not maybe working.
Okay.
So Hannah, do you want to start or we wait?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to start. So my name is Hannah Kohler. I'm here representing Professor Batakanjevic, because sadly for personal reasons, he was not able to attend today. So just to get to know a little bit about me, as you all know about the professor. I am a law student at Monash University in Australia, and I'm currently doing my exchange at Sciences Po in Paris. And I'm doing an internship with the IFIMES. So that is why I'm here today. And luckily that is how I met Professor Batakanjevic. So today my presentation will be on the access to education and its impacts on social and economic justice. Okay, it's not letting me play my slides. Give me just one moment, sorry. Okay, beautiful.
Yeah, good.
So
Yeah.
it's all good? Okay, beautiful, thank you. All right, so the need for access to education is more vital than ever before, with a generation interconnected in a way that we never previously imagined. And yet we're still seeing concerning numbers of children, meaning a person below the age of 18, who are not getting access to this necessary development tool. The right to education has been recognized as a basic human right and fundamental freedom in various international instruments and conventions, which include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention of Economic and Social Rights, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention of the Right of a Child, which makes elaborate provisions regarding human rights to education. Yet statistics are showing that not many children are actually getting access to this right. So, data collected by the UNESCO Institute of Statistics found that in 2019, only 84% of children completing their primary school education were actually completing their primary school education, with that number dropping to 71% for students in a high school education. Whilst continents such as Europe, North America, and Oceania, which are highly comprised of first world countries, are demonstrating high percentages of education rates. What's alarming in these statistics, to me at least, is surrounding less developed parts of the world, such as the sub-Saharan region of Africa, with 63% of students completing their primary school education and only 38% of people completing their secondary education, which is absolutely shocking. And it's really disheartening to see that so many people are not getting access to such an important tool. Now, how do these statistics connect with our desire for social and economic justice in everyday life? Well, when people have the ability to access the necessary education, they are more equipped to understand their rights and responsibilities and have better knowledge and tools that are required to participate in social and economic systems in their respective societies. So I'm going to unpack this. The first one refers to social justice. So the contribution of higher education to social justice suggests that higher education distribution should be fair and based on individual and societal benefits and values it produces once attained. There are many individual benefits to this model, which include social mobility, higher income compared to those of lower qualifications, improved health, and the social benefits of society are vast and can lead to less crime, greater democratic participation, and heightened climate awareness. The focus on social justice in higher education is not simply to do with economic gains, skill enhancements, and development, but it's also focused on critical reflexivity, as well as developing inclusive, equitable, and ethical practices in an inclusive, participatory, redistributive, and transformative framework, and many factors that will push this agenda of societal progress through the masses. I'm also wanting to talk about economic justice. And similarly, there's a strong link between education and training levels and the nation's economy. So using the sub-Saharan region of the world, once again, research was conducted regarding the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. There we go. The COVID-19 pandemic on the employment rates in Ethiopia, Malawi, Nigeria, and Uganda. This research, conducted and published by the World Bank's Living Standard Measurement Society, found a negative correlation between education levels and the likelihood of being jobless during the pandemic. So their studies found that at least the least educated were 4 to 7%. Oh, sorry, apologies for my slides. The least educated were 4 to 7% more likely to be jobless after 1 year into the pandemic than those with primary or high school education. Which is very disheartening, of course, to see, because obviously with a situation such as that, the whole crisis in itself was so difficult, and seeing those kinds of numbers is just, yeah, very disheartening. Now, if you remember my previous slides regarding the percentage of individuals completing their primary school education, only 63% are completing their primary school education. And so that's an alarming 37% of the population that would have been disadvantaged from being employed 1 year into the pandemic if you applied these 2019 statistics. This would put significant pressure on the economy to support the unemployed, which in many cases they struggled to do, as demonstrated by sub-Saharan Africa's ability to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic with fiscal measures compared to emerging economies, so emerging market economies, as well as the advanced economy, as you can see on my slides. Another aspect that is beneficial when talking about social and economic justice to do with education is having a necessary skill set. So further, education further promotes participatory justice by teaching the necessary skills in order to help people and encourage people to engage within the economic and social systems of their society. Known as human capital, the economic value of a worker's experience and skills is tremendous. So education can help individuals understand financial concepts such as budgeting and investment. It can also help develop their skills that they need to navigate the job market and negotiating fair wages and working conditions. Another benefit is also to do with advocating. So education can also promote participatory justice by providing individuals with the tools they need to advocate for their rights and to participate in the decision-making processes that affect their life. This includes developing critical thinking and communication skills, as well as understanding how to access and utilize resources and support networks. So in Australia, for instance, all citizens over the age of 18 are required to vote, with certain exceptions, of course. If we not only just have the required knowledge, but the skill set to understand prepositions and developments within our country, we are more likely to have societies that reflect the desires of the larger range of educated individuals, rather than having situations where we have a concept of donkey voting, which is essentially you're just voting based on a random choice and not based on having prior knowledge on the party in question. Another benefit is social mobility. So moreover, education can also promote social mobility, meaning the change to one's socioeconomic situation, which can lead to greater economic and social participation for individuals and communities. So according to Oelich and Al, so awfully, I can't say names very well, but you get my point. He found that the migration of workers with higher education has a significant impact on the strengthening and the competitiveness and economic development of countries, which leads to obviously a better standard of living. By providing individuals with skills and knowledge they need to succeed in the labor market, education can help break the cycle of poverty and inequality that often limits social and economic mobility. For instance, economically, through education, individuals are more likely to be capable of starting and running a business, obtaining a higher paying job, or having the financial literacy and ability to invest in assets such as stocks or property. Socially, they are able to better involve themselves in dialogue regarding their country's socio-cultural and political legal environment, increasing their ability to use their voice for change. According to another study by Jill Suddy in 2020, they found that it suggests that social and economic justice in your country plays a really large role in your overall happiness. And one of the speakers within that article, Isaac Prelenskevy, I can't say his name, I apologize again. He argues that it's less likely that countries that enjoy a good level of social justice will be less discriminatory towards migrants, asylum seekers, and other strangers, which is obviously a huge debate and topic in our society at this current point in time. Stating that the reasons for economic prosperity of countries where social justice is stronger is embedded in the economic development of the country in itself. So in summary, and I apologize for my long speech, but in summary, access to education is critical in promoting participatory justice in the economic and social sphere of everyday life. Education provides individuals with the skills and knowledge they need to navigate economic and social systems, advocating for their rights and to participate fully in decision-making processes of their country. Additionally, education can also promote social mobility, which can lead to greater economic and social participation for individuals and community. And to finish this talk, I would love to leave you with a quote, as common as it is, but this is truly one of my favorites, said by the Honorable Dalai Lama. He says that everything is interconnected. My interest is linked to everyone else's. Our survival and future are linked. Therefore, the destruction of your so-called enemy is actually the destruction of yourself. And why I think this quote is so important is if you truly wish to change the world, you got to look at helping everyone around you, not just your friends. And that's why I really, really believe in this quote. And I think it's super important. And I thank you guys so much for giving me your time today. And I am very, very honored to be here. And the speakers were absolutely brilliant. And I've learned so, so much in such a short period of time. So I thank you once again for listening to me speak.